Will the Fed crash the economy? A lot of concern these days is about the Fed raising interest rates and as a result causing a recession. Let's investigate. The Fed is the central bank of the US. It influences short-term interest rates in the US by setting the Fed funds rate. Basically, if the Fed moves the Fed funds rate higher, short-term interest rates will move higher too. So the interest rate on consumer loans and credit cards, which are short-term interest rates, will also move higher. And on the flip side, if the Fed moves the Fed funds rate lower, short-term interest rates will fall. And the interest rate on consumer loans and credit cards will fall too. So let's take a look at how increases in the Fed funds rate affects the general economy. This graph here shows the period from 1967 to the end of 2022. The blue line represents the Fed funds rate, and the vertical orange lines represent recession periods. From this graph, you can see that interest rate increasing cycles are commonly followed by recessions. Now, this pattern of a rate increasing cycle followed by a recession is repeated multiple times over this 55-year period. Now, even though the pattern exists, it's not possible from the graph to exactly pinpoint how soon a recession occurs after a rate hiking cycle begins. So, for example, in early 1972, the Fed started raising rates, and a recession started less than 2 years later in late 1973. But on another occasion, the Fed started raising rates in 2004, and it took around 3 years after the rate increases started for a recession to occur in 2007. Now, more recently, the Fed started raising rates in the first quarter of 2022. And so even though there's a high probability of a recession happening sometime on the horizon, it's impossible to say when a recession will occur. So with the strong correlation between increasing interest rates and an ensuing recession, why would the Fed raise rates in the first place? To understand the Fed's decision around interest rates, we need to know the Fed's objectives. The Fed has two main goals and has to balance between the two. The first goal is to control inflation so that it doesn't get too high. The second goal is to help the US economy achieve positive GDP growth or prevent recessions from lasting too long or prevent the recessions from becoming too severe. So let's first look at why controlling inflation is so important to the Fed. Imagine that this year it costs $15 for a meal at your favorite restaurant, and your hourly salary is $15. Working 1 hour can buy a meal at your favorite restaurant. However, if next year inflation raises the cost of a meal at your favorite restaurant by 6.7%, the cost of that same meal is now $16. If your hourly salary didn't change and stayed at $15, working 1 hour can no longer buy that same meal at your favorite restaurant. You became poorer even though your salary stayed the same. Your salary didn't increase, but your real salary decreased. So whenever economists use the term real, it refers to adjusting for the effect of inflation. Let's look at this graph, which shows the historical inflation from 1953 to the end of 2022. So from this graph, you can see that inflation has gone higher than 14%, and it's even been negative on at least 3 occasions. Now, inflation at the end of 2022 was higher than 6% and even recorded higher than 8% around the middle of 2022, which was the highest inflation rate recorded in the last 40 years. So as can be seen from the period in the 1970s, once high inflation settles in, it can take a long time to bring down, as it took almost the entire decade of the 70s to get inflation on a downward trajectory. So the Fed wants to get inflation down as quickly as possible. Now, currently, the Fed's goal is to reduce inflation to 2.5%, which is a long way down from its reading above 6% at the end of 2022. This graph of the period from 1967 to 1994 shows even more clearly the destructive effects of inflation. The inflation rate is in blue, recorded GDP is in orange, and real GDP is in gray. Now remember, real GDP is GDP which is adjusted for the effect of inflation. Now, looking at the average of the orange line, GDP growth rate over the period was greater than 8% and never below 0%. So essentially, the economy never had negative growth. But average inflation over the period was greater than 5%, with the highest inflation over the period coming in at more than 14%. As a result, despite GDP growth averaging over 8% over the period, real GDP growth after adjusting for the effect of inflation averaged only slightly higher than 3%. This means that inflation destroyed 5% of GDP growth over the period. Also, looking at that gray line on the chart, which is real GDP, you can see that there were actually 5 instances over the period where real GDP was negative. In other words, the orange GDP line never actually recorded negative growth, but on 5 instances, inflation was so high it created the effect of shrinking the economy. So, you could say that many people became poorer during those 5 periods of negative real GDP because the inflation rate exceeded the GDP growth rate. All this historical data should convince us that if the Fed has the tools to keep inflation from rising too high, it should use them. And that's exactly what the Fed has historically done using its main inflation fighting weapon, the Fed funds rate. This chart goes from 1955 to the end of 2022 and plots the Fed funds rate in blue and the inflation rate in orange. We can see that whenever the orange line representing the inflation rate rises too much or too quickly, the Fed raises the Fed funds rate to bring inflation back down. Just using some common sense, if interest rates go up, we should reduce the amount of money we borrow. As well, banks may be more reluctant to give loans to borrowers, which, as a result, people will have less money and we should reduce our spending, which should reduce demand for most goods. In turn, reduced demand for goods should reduce the amount that prices can be raised. So, finally, the inflation rate should become lower, which is great, isn't it? But every good result has a side effect, and in order to reduce inflation, higher interest rates may actually end up reducing spending too much to the point of recession. Once again, let's look at the chart with the Fed funds rate indicated by the blue line and recessions indicated by the vertical orange lines. We see the obvious pattern of rate increases followed by recessions, and the current fast pace of rate increases, as you can see by looking at the blue line at the right side of the chart. But let's not assume that the Fed is trying to cause recessions. Looking at the chart from another angle, the Fed also prevents recessions from lasting too long or becoming too severe by lowering the Fed funds rate. When the Fed begins decreasing the Fed funds rate quickly and by a lot, recessions end soon afterwards. Money becomes cheaper to borrow, so people can take more loans and have more money to invest or spend and boost the economy out of recession. So basically right now the Fed is moving rates higher so that it has ample space to move rates down to save the economy if a recession occurs in the future. A good example when the Fed didn't have ample space to lower rates occurred during the recession that happened in 2020. From 2015 to 2019, the Fed raised rates from nearly 0% to about 2.4%. In 2020, when a recession occurred, it didn't have much room to lower rates since it could only lower from 2.4% to 0%, which wasn't enough of a drop in rates to save the economy. The US government had to help the Fed save the economy by sending cash directly to individuals in 2020 to provide more spending stimulus. And the Fed had to use less conventional methods other than interest rate decreases to save the economy at that time. So to summarize, the Fed doesn't intentionally crash the economy. It merely raises rates to fight high inflation or create enough space to lower rates later when a recession happens. In effect, it's planning ahead for a rainy day. Now, these recessions commonly start after the Fed starts raising its interest rates. The Fed may or it may not cause these recessions. That's impossible to actually put the blame on them. Now, the timing of these recessions after the Fed starts its rate rising cycle is not predictable based on historical data. And when these recessions occur, the Fed lowers its rates to save the economy. That's why it's raising rates now, so that it has these rate decreases saved for when a crisis occurs. So even though the end of cheap money is hard to accept, we need to thank the Fed for preparing ahead of time to save the economy from a future recession when it eventually happens. So with that being said, everybody stay safe and see you next time.